Welcome to the Tank Podcast. In this week's episode, editorial assistant Matteo Pini met with Paul Turner of Integrate Private Schools. Together, they discussed the inherent inequity of the British school system and how urgent reform is needed within the sector.
I guess starting on quite a fundamental point, why should we be abolishing private schools?
Okay, so it's a very odd system that we have in the UK, and the level of inequality that everyone seems to think is just normal is completely different to what's experienced in other parts of the world. And there's obviously a story to that in terms of the way that historically our education system developed and the role of private schools within that mix in terms of the private and state kind of relationship. And that obviously has waxed and waned throughout history. But we're now in a position where we've got some extreme levels of inequality, that society is divided. And what we see is that education is kind of a key part of that. You know, these sorts of schools are engines of inequality. They drive that inequality in wider society with that disproportionate opportunities, resource. There's a whole variety of factors that mean there's a very small group of people who benefit from what in the general public is perceived as being a very natural and normal situation. But the reality is that the current system is detrimental to wider society and is damaging for most people.
And of course, privately educated people make up the majority of judges, a considerable number of MPs, actors, celebrities. How do you think it affects decision making on a higher level?
Yeah, most certainly. We've seen that, and there's been quite high profile, I guess, things that have happened politically, which we would put down to stemming from people's experience in their school life, the way that they were brought up, that it's that isolated experience where young people are separated from the rest of society and educated within a very small group of people. And what it means is that they lack that ability to understand how most people live and to understand what the rest of society is like. And I think that runs through into their later life, and decisions that are made, you know, as much as they might actively say they're making efforts to redress that and to experience life in its fullest, I think fundamentally it shifts people's perspectives and it just changes the way that decisions are made.
I guess you see that with our past Prime Minister and the one for me, one for everybody else kind of decision making.
Exactly, yeah. You know, we've seen that idea that these people think of themselves as being separate from, because when they were in school, they were separate from. They didn't have to have the same experiences. And it means that it became very normalized to think that everyone lived in the lives that like they do. I mean, what's also interesting as well is there's an environmental perspective to this as well, that the majority of people who go to these schools live extravagant lifestyles where their carbon emissions is dramatically different to the majority of people in the UK. And you know, it also reflects in the resources of these schools, the footprint of the schools, the trips that happen around that. But it's also to do with the wider lifestyles of these people, which they think is how the majority of people live, because that is how many of the people within those kind of spheres live. There's another interesting one about Rishi Sunak and his £1 million that he's paid to upgrade his electricity. No, sorry, it was £1 million for his tax over the last 3 years. But also the amount that he's paid to upgrade the electrical supply to heat his swimming pool. You know, these are decisions that no one else in society is making, and yet we've got someone who's leading the country who those are the sorts of day-to-day decisions they're making.
In terms of the students themselves, I guess there's a kind of psychological element there, considering a considerable number of private schools are boarding schools and there's a separation from the family unit. What kind of impact do you think that has?
Yeah, again, you know, even it doesn't have to be a boarding school, but there's schools where the length of the school day is so extended. There are schools that operate a 6-day a week, and it means that there's this dislocation from the rest of a family life, and often that is seen as a good thing, and it's young people getting their fullest experience. You know, they can be fully immersed in education, but as a group of people, we believe that's detrimental to wider society, because there are things that are really beneficial for people to experience as part of a holistic sort of family upbringing that schools just can't make up for, and actually it leads to some detrimental impacts.
Speaking on a more practical level, how could it work? Say we abolish private schools today. What are the steps? What's the process involved?
I guess this is part of why we shifted from that abolish language, is because abolish, again, is quite confrontational. We're not suggesting that we shut these places down and then suddenly all these children and teachers have to find new schools. The premise of talking about integration is the idea of bringing them into state ownership, state running, that they exist within the state framework. And what that means is they would still operate, within the spaces and buildings and all those sorts of things. But eventually they wouldn't be these private entities that they are. And many of these operate as, I guess, almost, they do have charitable status, but they are private businesses. And they see the parents and students as customers, and decision-making is very much influenced by that perception that there is a product that's being paid for. And I think, again, we saw that with the response to COVID and the centre assessed grades, the way that teachers, there was evidence to suggest that teachers within private schools played the system, or at least they interpreted the rules differently to teachers in state schools. And that meant it had an influence on the outcomes, the results for those students. And I think that's something, again, that we're keen to sort of counter, is that sort of relationship of, because someone's paying for a product, it changes the dynamic. I do think then one of the first things is removal of charitable status. It's a farce that these places exist as charities. A lot of these schools have lots of very good PR and marketing around funding places for students or relationships with local state schools. But the reality of that, the proportion is so small, that is insignificant in the grand scheme of things. And I think then that would start to shift kind of how these schools operate. Then many of them actually are quite precarious in terms of their financial situation. And that isn't how education should be. It shouldn't be that they operate within this system. And I understand that, what we're also calling for is appropriate funding for the state sector. And we recognise there are most certainly problems, as we were sort of saying, many of us are involved in the recent strikes to ensure that teachers have appropriate paying conditions. So it is a sort of a mixture of the two. I guess what I'm sort of getting at is that charitable status is a really fundamental part to start unlocking this. And then we've got things like VAT. And then I guess ultimately it's actually starting to the state to actually start beginning to control some of these schools.
Do you think it's all of this is a particularly British phenomenon?
I think it most certainly is a British problem, and that's to do with the way that historically these schools have developed, and it really is linked to concepts of colonialism as well. That many of these schools were set up for educating the children of people involved in the military, but also links with trading companies and, I guess, religious connotations and sort of links as well. But what's interesting now as well is that it seems to be flipped, in that many of these schools are now operating international schools as well. So they're influencing the educational markets and systems in sort of the Middle East, but all kinds of parts of the world, where now UK schools are sort of having an influence, which again is an interesting thing to explore. I don't think there's any other country in the world, though, that has such a stark difference in terms of inequality. I know in the American system there are private schools, and so maybe there's parallels in the American system. But I guess it's slightly different because of the way that the states operate and the sort of educational systems within each state. What's also interesting where we are is how different the situation is in Scotland. Being in just across the border, that actually there are very few independent schools in Scotland, and just in terms of the market is quite different, even though it's so close to us.
In terms of land, specifically for boarding schools, would they be changed into state boarding schools? Or would they all be sent home?
So state boarding schools do exist. There are a handful of them, and I think the numbers have diminished. There are certain reasons why you might, in quite extreme circumstances, need to operate state boarding schools. I know lots of that's linked to military families. I think we would probably question that, though, and the necessity for that. That maybe there's a better way in order to structure that kind of care. what's interesting is many of these schools disproportionately have very large estates. And I'm sure every one of us can imagine within our local area that within only a few kilometers, with only a few minutes distance, you've got children who are being educated in large estates with lots of open space, lots of green space. And then down the road, there's a school that they've got a car park and maybe a playing field at the most. But, the experience of those children is vastly different. I think that access to space and greater equality with that is also part of this. But it's also that sense that many of these schools own large parts of England. We're talking about Eton. Eton is a massive landowner, and thinking about what happens to that space is an interesting one. That maybe the benefits, both financially but also in terms of use of that space, should be opened up to the public more. We did see some of this during COVID. There were some private schools who started opening up their estates for people to go and wander around and use as green space. But again, that was quite a token sort of element. I think the other interesting thing is investments. Many of these private schools have massive investments. And actually, again, environmentally, many of these investments are in fossil fuels, and they're gaining millions in returns from these investments each year, and I guess a lot of that is to do with history in terms of why they have those and how they've had them, and a lot of it is also kind of self-fulfilling in that they have then endowments and donations, but the scale of that compared to the funding for many state schools is just ridiculous.
I guess in terms of kind of social integration, obviously, some of these schools have been entrenched for nearly 600 years. How would you say that upon integration, we change people's attitudes towards their own privilege? What would the steps be?
Well, I think there's the potential, because often this is seen as quite a negative, that we're taking away opportunity from people. I think the thing to recognize is how small a group of people who benefit from this and how disproportionate the benefit is. I think something I was going to mention earlier as well is there's a really good book called The Inner Level, which leads on from the spirit level. And it's all about how inequality affects the way that we think about other people and the way that we operate, even to the extent of where you might walk and the spaces you might use. And, this school experience is a kind of a really fundamental part of that. But the bit also that I wanted to say is this is also about having a positive vision for education. This is about saying, look, we can do things differently. Imagine if, what if people went through schooling where actually the experience from one school to another was really similar? Not in a sense that we suddenly kind of make it all grey and there's no variety, but so that everyone had much greater equality in their opportunity. We can see that particularly, as you've sort of said, in terms of the roles people go on to in future life. Lots of that is to do with the networking and the connections that you get from going to these sorts of schools. And I know that there's some really interesting movements like the 93% Club that are trying to counter that. Imagine going to a school where within that school, there's people from all walks of life, from a real diversity. There's not the kind of creaming off of a certain group of people who've chosen to pay a really disproportionate amount for their education, but instead people's experience is really varied, and they meet people from all different walks of life.
Sounds dreamy, to be honest. It sounds like a world I want to be in. I'm also just curious about the negative psychological impacts it must have on certain private school students. In 2019, Vice published an article detailing former Etonians' responses to your campaign, and their responses really fascinated me and surprised me, because there was an element that they'd almost never thought about it before, and they couldn't, because they'd grown up in such a stratified way. There was a failure of imagination. They weren't able to think about a more equal democratic society. Maybe I'm being too generous.
No, I think you're right. And I think this is a dangerous shift as well that we're seeing in wider society, with healthcare, with the way that we travel, with housing. And this, like you say, a stratified system where people are becoming more and more comfortable with the fact that, we just need to pay, that it's about paying for these sorts of things, when actually something like education and healthcare similarly is so fundamental that as a society, we are one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Surely this is something where we can really provide the same opportunities and access to all young people.
I'm also curious about the idea of labeling and naming and language around schools, the idea that a private school already confers a kind of privilege, whereas a state school, I mean, in my mind, state has a kind of, it's got a politicized element to it. I just wonder how...
Well, is it not ridiculous that where you went to school still has an impact on people, 20, 30 years down the line, that they meet people and they say, I went to, we shouldn't be in a system where the name of your school still has an influence on you and your career and your life in so much further down the line. There's so many examples of that, and it just seems ridiculous.
How would you respond to the idea that private schools claim they offer a service for disadvantaged students, people who really need education, and they're providing the top quality in the country?
Yeah, I guess because we would query this idea of how you measure top quality and the sort of use of some of this language. I think we know that in terms of resource, these schools have far more staff for the number of children than state schools. So it's almost like they're hoarding, teachers, resource, space, all of these sorts of things. And the teachers themselves have more time to be able to be creative and to engage in other things. And so it's that sort of redressing of those sorts of things that's really important. Not to suggest that we need to come down to the sort of where everything is in the state sector, but instead, by looking at this with new eyes, there's the opportunity to sort of explore it more. The opportunity that these schools provide, though, really is for a very small group of the richest people within society. And as I sort of said, that often what's said is we have bursaries, we offer places for disadvantaged children, but the number of these children is so small that it's a tokenistic. The other thing I was going to say as well is that often the kind of response is, why take away this opportunity and choice for parents if they want it? But the reality is that the choice is not there for the majority as well. So it's it's a false idea to suggest that it's a choice for everyone. So many of these schools, obviously there's a variation in terms of the amount of money that's paid, but for many of these schools, the annual school fee is more than the average, the median income in the UK. So to suggest that anyone has the ability, the spare money to spend on this is just ludicrous. The thing I think that's really interesting is the way that private schools communicate and kind of sell a story, a narrative around themselves. And I think that's linked to this idea that so many people who've gone through private education are in positions of power and able to sort of facilitate this. So being in the media or being a politician, and can present this in a way which actually distorts the reality of the current situation.
Do you have any formal relationship with private schools? Have you had any communications with any of the major private schools?
As a group, I guess, we were invited, I think it was last year, to go and speak at Eton, and we took part in a debate at Eton College. Which
How did that go?
It felt a bit like going into a lion's den. Yeah. I think more personally, what's interesting maybe from my background is I did go to a private school when I was a child, and also I have spent some time teaching in private schools as well. So I think my experience has been an interesting one because I've seen it from the inside and also wanted to change the system from the inside, but reached a point where I realized that it's just not possible, that this is a fundamental shift where these schools need to not exist.
You were speaking about the expansion of private schools into other countries, the kind of branding of a high quality British education being exported across the world. Would you say there's anything neo-colonial about that?
Yeah, most certainly it is. Yeah. And what's been reported is that there are deaths associated with the construction of many of these schools because of the conditions of the workers. Many of them, it's migrant labor that's used within these countries. And then also the situation of the schooling is even more perverse because it's a weird hybrid where you get many local people, but also there's international children. The schools themselves essentially are paying for the brand and the logo of an institution, whilst actually the reality is many of them are operated by consultancies and have very little connection. And much of this actually is about private schools reaping financial benefit from a situation where there's opportunity. And again, is that something that we should be seeing in an education system? Shouldn't their focus be the education of young people in the UK? Now, I kind of understand many of them are painting this as there's a financial benefit for students in the UK because they receive money that can then be used to subsidise education in the UK. But again, that feels relatively exploitative if we're then using families and children in other parts of the world to be able to benefit people in the UK. I definitely feel like there's the potential for this to be better regulated. And particularly if schools are operating in that way, how can you then justify being a charity in the UK if you've got private businesses set up internationally that are then bringing you financial gain?
Just to close things off, in 2019, we came actually quite close to abolishing private schools. Where do we stand now?
Well, Labour have committed to this, and I think as a group we feel pretty confident that at the next election we're going to see political change, and it might not come as swiftly as we want, but I think there's momentum to continue this. And I also think that the current situation and what we've witnessed over the last few years exposes this, exposes the reality of this inequality. People are waking up to this, and the more that we can build momentum around that campaign, and we can also help expose and for people to better understand the reality of this. As we say, this situation at the moment is detrimental to most of us, and particularly for wider society. And unlocking this and sort of changing the system is part of creating a better society.
To hear more podcasts from Tank, you can subscribe on all major podcast platforms or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is by Himera.